There is a discipline to standing still that no one who has not done it can ever fully understand. People look at a man in the red tunic and the tall black bearskin and they think they see a statue, a piece of the architecture, a thing they can lean against for a photograph or shout at to see if it blinks. What they do not see is the man inside the stillness, and what that man is doing. I can tell you, because for 19 years I was that man, and the stillness was never empty. It was the busiest thing I ever did. My name is Daniel Reeve. For most of my life I stood the gates in the forecourts of Aldermont, the great pale palace of the House of Wesson, and I learned there what it costs to hold a position when everything in you wants to move. But the lesson that made me the guard I became did not happen at Aldermont at all. It happened years before, on a cold night at a place called Brennan Wharf, and I carried it under the wool of that tunic every single day I served. I will come to it. I have to, because without it none of the rest of what I did on the night of the midsummer illumination would make any sense, least of all to me. Let me set the scene as it was, before any of it went wrong. The new king had been on the throne not quite a year, and the country wanted to love him, the way people want to love anything new and untested when they are tired of being uncertain. The palace, sensing this, decided to give them a night to remember. The midsummer illumination, they called it, though it had no history that I knew of beyond someone's clever idea the previous winter. There would be music and lights strung across the whole south face of Aldermont, and fountains lit from beneath, and at the end of it, a great display of fireworks fired from the river terrace, so that the whole forecourt would be turned gold and then red and then white. Tens of thousands would come. Half the country, it seemed, would watch on their screens. It was to be the kind of evening that made a rain. To stage it, the palace did not trust its own people. That was the first mistake, though no one called it a mistake at the time. They brought in a man. His name was Aldous Crewe, and he was famous in the way that men who arrange spectacles for the very rich become famous, which is to say he was famous among people who could afford him, and unknown to everyone else, until the papers needed a name. He had lit coronations in other countries, weddings of the kind that cost more than small towns, the openings of buildings that no ordinary person would ever be allowed to enter. He arrived at Aldermont 3 weeks before midsummer with a retinue, and a way of walking through rooms that had been built for kings, as though the kings had merely been keeping them warm for him. I disliked him within the first hour, and I am not a man who decides quickly, but I have stood a long time and watched a great many people, and you learn to read them the way you read weather. Some men carry themselves as though they owe the world something. Some carry themselves as though the world owes them. Crewe walked as though the debt had already been settled in his favor, and he was simply here to collect. What you must understand about a guardsman is that we are trained out of opinions, or trained to keep them so deep they do not show. So I had opinions about Aldous Crewe and I showed nothing, and for 3 weeks I watched him build his spectacle on the south forecourt, and I said not one word that I was not required to say. He built it fast and he built it big. Along both sides of the forecourt, where the crowd would naturally gather, his people raised grandstands, great temporary structures of steel scaffold and timber decking, tier upon tier of bench seating rising up so that the favored guests, the donors and the dignitaries and the families who had won their places in some lottery the palace had dreamed up to seem generous, could sit above the heads of the standing crowd and have a clear view of the king's box and the river beyond. The largest of these stands ran the whole length of the eastern wall, and it was a serious piece of construction, 8 tiers high, with a draped front of timber boarding and bunting in the royal colors, hung the full length of it to hide the bare scaffold and make the thing look like part of the palace rather than what it was, which was a temporary structure thrown up in a fortnight. It was at the southern corner of that eastern stand that I would be posted on the night. I knew the spot well by the time midsummer came, because I had stood my watches there through the building of it, and a man who stands in one place for hours at a time comes to know that place better than the men who built it. I knew where the scaffold creaked when the wind came off the river. I knew the smell of the new timber and the varnish and the canvas of the bunting. I knew the heat that came off the great banks of stage lighting crew had mounted along the front of the stand and behind the king's box, lights as hot as ovens, throwing their warmth back into the timber on the still evenings. I knew the cabling, two fat black snakes of it run along behind the draped boarding, taped and bundled and in places, I thought, run closer to the timber and the bunting than I would have liked. I am not an engineer, but I had spent a great deal of my life standing very near to things, paying attention to them, while everyone else hurried past. And I knew the gate. At the southern end of the eastern stand, where I was to be posted, there was an exit through the old palace wall, a wide stone arch with iron gates that gave onto the river terrace and the wider grounds beyond. In the original plan, that gate was the principal escape route for the eastern stand. If anything went wrong, the guests on those 8 tiers were to come down the southern stairs, through the arch, and out to the open terrace. It was the only way out on that side that did not feed back into the crush of the standing crowd in the forecourt. I had heard the palace's own safety men say as much, walking the ground in the second week, pointing and nodding and writing on their boards. 3 days before midsummer, Crew had the gate chained. I saw it done. One of his people came with a length of heavy chain and a padlock and ran it through the iron and snapped it shut, and when the palace safety man, a careful, tired sort of man named Holloway, came to ask why, Crew told him. I was 12 feet away, standing my watch, and I heard every word, and I will remember the words as long as I remember anything. Because, Crew said, in the patient, amused way he had as though explaining something simple to a child, I cannot have my guests wandering out onto the terrace during the display. The terrace is in shot. The river is in shot. I have cameras placed for the whole arc of the thing, and the moment some bored uncle decides to step out for air, he is in every frame the country will see for the next 10 years. The gate stays shut until the fireworks are done. They can go out through the front like everyone else after. Holloway said something about the regulations, about the stand needing 2 means of escape. Crew smiled at him, and I watched the smile do its work, and Holloway, who was a good man and a tired one, and who had been overruled by such men his whole working life, looked at the padlock and looked at the cameras and looked at the great glittering machine of the evening that everyone above him wanted to happen, and he wrote something on his board, and he went away. The gate stayed chained. And after that there was only the front of the stand and the southern stairs feeding into the forecourt crowd, which is to say there was, for 8 tiers of people, one way out. I said nothing. I want to be honest about that. I stood my watch and I said nothing because that was not my place, and because Holloway had said it and been overruled, and because a guardsman does not run a palace, he guards it. But I marked the gate. I marked it the way you mark anything you think you might one day need to know in a hurry. I noted that the chain was run through both leaves and through the central post, and that the padlock hung on the inner side, and that the gate, even chained, had perhaps a hand's width of play in it. I noted that the timber boarding nearest the gate was the same draped boarding that ran the whole front of the stand, and that behind it the cabling and the lighting transformers were bundled thickest of all, because that southern corner was where Crew had massed his brightest effects to catch the river. I noted these things and I filed them, and then I stood, and the days went on toward midsummer. Now I will tell you about Brennan Wharf, because you cannot understand why I noticed what I noticed, or why it cost me what it cost me to keep standing without it. I was 23. I was not yet a king's guardsman. I was a soldier of the line, posted to a supply depot on the cold northern coast, a sprawl of warehouses and store sheds where the army kept its stockpiles against the winter. It was a dull posting and I was a dull soldier, which is to say a good one, attentive and unimaginative, and one night in the worst of the winter I was on the warehouse watch and I smelled smoke. It was nothing. It was the faintest thing, a thread under the salt and the diesel and the cold, and when I followed it I found nothing, only the long dark aisles of crates and the wind working at the roof. But I knew. I cannot tell you how I knew. I only know that some part of me, The animal part that the army had not trained out of me yet stood up and would not lie back down. I went to the duty officer, a young lieutenant named Aldridge who was warm and dry in the guard room and did not want to be otherwise, and I told him I thought there was a fire somewhere in the stores, that I could smell it, that I could not find it but I knew it was there. And Aldridge looked at me and looked at the warmth of his guard room and asked me what I had found, and I said nothing yet. And he told me to stand my post and stop imagining things, that a man who raised the depot in the middle of the night on a smell and found nothing would be a man who looked very foolish in the morning, and so would the officer who let him. I stood my post. I want that understood. I was 23 and I had been told by the man whose word was law to stand my post, and I stood it, and I told myself I had imagined it. And 40 minutes later the fire that had been smoldering in a transformer behind the far wall of the third warehouse, in a place I could not have found in 100 years of looking, came up through the crates and took the whole of the stores in under an hour. 4 men died at Brennan Wharf. 3 of them were asleep in the storekeeper's billet that backed onto the third warehouse, and they never woke. The 4th was Aldridge, who went in after them when he understood what he had done and did not come out. I carried 2 of them myself, the ones we reached, out across the frozen yard, and they were already gone, and I have carried them every day since in a different way. There was an inquiry, and it found that the fire could not have been predicted, that the transformer fault was hidden, that no reasonable man could have known. They were kind to Aldridge's memory, and they were kind to me. No one blamed the soldier who smelled smoke and was told to stand down. But I knew. I had smelled it. The animal part of me had stood up, and I had told it to lie back down because a man with rank told me I would look foolish, and 4 men died. I made myself a promise on the frozen yard at Brennan Wharf, with the heat of the burning stores on one side of my face and the cold of the dead man in my arms, and the promise was this, that I would never again be the man who knew and stood still. I would stand still for everything else. I would stand still through insult and provocation, and the long gray hours and the aching cold, because that is the discipline, and the discipline is real and it matters. But if I ever again smelled smoke, I would not wait to be told. I would not weigh my dignity against a stranger's life. I would move. That is the man who stood at the southern corner of the eastern stand on the night of the midsummer illumination. Not a statue, a man with a promise under his tunic, watching. The evening came in warm and still. That is the first thing I want you to feel, because it mattered more than anyone knew. There was no wind off the river, none. The air dead and heavy the way it gets before a summer storm that never quite arrives, and the heat of the day was still rising off the stone of the forecourt as the light went. A still night is a beautiful thing for an illumination. The smoke from the fireworks would hang and glow instead of blowing away. The fountains would not be ruffled. The lights would burn clean. Crew had prayed for a night exactly like this one, and he had got it, and he walked the forecourt in the last of the daylight like a man whose God had answered him. The crowd came in their tens of thousands. The standing crowd filled the forecourt from the palace steps to the far gates, a sea of people with their phones already up, the little screens lit like a field of fireflies before the real lights had even begun. And the stands filled, tier by tier, the favored guests climbing the timber stairs in their good clothes, the donors and the diplomats and the lottery families, the children among them in their best, the small ones hoisted onto shoulders and onto laps. The eastern stand filled last and fullest, 8 tiers, 1,000 people or more above my head, and I stood at the southern corner of it in my red tunic and my bearskin with my rifle at my shoulder, and I watched them come. And I noted the children the way I noted everything. There was a family directly above me on the 3rd tier, a father and a mother and 2 girls, the younger perhaps 4, in a yellow dress, with a paper crown someone had given her at the gate. I noted the yellow dress. I do not know why, except that you note the small ones. You always note the small ones. The music began. The lights came up the face of Aldermont in waves, gold and then white. And the crowd made the sound a great crowd makes, a long, low gasp of pleasure, and Aldous Crew stood at his console on the river terrace with his headset and his banks of screens and conducted the whole thing like an orchestra. And for a while it was, I will admit, magnificent. I have guarded a great many state occasions and I have seen a great deal of pomp, and this was as fine a thing as I ever saw. The king came out onto his box on the palace steps and the crowd roared for him, and he raised a hand, young and uncertain and pleased, and I felt, standing there in the warm, dead air, something close to the simple gladness the whole country was meant to feel. It was perhaps an hour into the evening, with the light show running and the fireworks still an hour off, that I first smelled it. It was nothing. It was the faintest thing, a thread under the warm stone and the crowd and the cut grass smell of the trampled forecourt and the faint sulphur that already hung about the place from the test firing earlier. But I knew. The animal part of me, the part I had made my promise to, stood up. I did not move. Understand that. I did not so much as turn my head. A guardsman who breaks his bearing in the middle of a state illumination, because he thinks he smells something, is a guardsman who is in every frame of the country's memory for the next 10 years, exactly as Crew had said of his bored uncle, and worse, he is a guardsman who makes 10,000 people glance at him and wonder, and a crowd that begins to wonder is a crowd that is one breath from fear. So I did not move. But I let the animal stand up, and I began, behind that unmoving face, to do the work. The smell was behind me and above me, behind the draped boarding at the southern corner, where the cabling was thickest and the transformers for Crew's brightest effects were massed. I knew it the way you know which tooth aches. I could not have pointed to it. But I knew the corner, and I knew, from 3 weeks of standing in it, exactly what was behind that boarding, and I knew that the great banks of stage lighting had been burning into the still air for an hour, throwing their heat back into the timber, and that a still night gives a thing no chance to cool. I have thought since that the fault was probably in the transformers, or in the cabling run too close to the hot lamps, or in both, that something had been heating slowly all evening behind the bunting and the boarding, in the one place no one could see, exactly as the transformer had heated behind the far wall at Brennan Wharf, in a place I could not find in 100 years. I have thought since that Crew, who had massed his effects in that corner for the cameras, and chained the gate beside it for the cameras, and overruled the tired safety man for the cameras, had built, without knowing it, the precise conditions of my oldest nightmare. I did not know all that then. Then I only knew the smell and the corner and the promise. I did the careful thing first, because the careful thing is always first, and a man who has buried 4 people for want of the careful thing does not skip it. There was a sergeant of my own regiment posted at the foot of the southern stairs, 10 feet from me, a steady man named Holt whom I had known 15 years. I could not speak. A guardsman at his post does not speak, but Holt knew me, and there is a language between men who have stood together. I shifted my eyes to him, held them, and then, very slightly, turned my head a few degrees toward the draped boarding and back. It was nothing a camera would catch. It was everything Holt needed. He came to me, low and quiet, the way a sergeant moves when he does not want a crowd to notice him moving, and he stood close at my shoulder and said under the music, "What?" "Fire," I said, barely moving my lips. "Behind the boarding, southern corner, I can smell it." Holt was a good man. He did not argue and he did not laugh. But I saw him weigh it, the way Aldrich had weighed it on the frozen coast, and I understood his problem because it was the same problem, and there was no smoke yet and no flame and nothing in the warm, still air but a thread that one man swore he could smell. "You sure?" he said. "No," I said. "That's why I'm telling you and not pulling them out. Get Holloway. Get the safety man. Tell him the eastern stand, southern corner behind the lighting. Tell him I'd want it looked at now, not after the fireworks." Holt went. I want that on the record too. Holt did exactly the right thing, fast and without fuss. He went to find Holloway and he found him, and Holloway came. I saw him moving along the back of the stand, the tired, careful man, and I felt for one moment the relief of a man who has done the careful thing and been heard. And then Aldous Crew came down off his terrace. He came because his cameras had caught it. Not the smoke. There was no smoke yet, but the movement. A sergeant breaking from his post to whisper to a sentry. A safety man hurrying along the back of the stand during the show. To Crew, on his bank of screens, it was a flaw in the picture. A thing out of place in the magnificent machine he was conducting. And Aldous Crew could no more tolerate a flaw in his picture than he could tolerate being told no. He came across the front of the stand with two of his people behind him, and he reached Holloway first, and I heard him, because the music had dropped to a low passage and the warm air carried. "What is this?" Crew said. "What are you doing? We are 40 minutes from the finale, and you are walking my set like a man looking for a lost dog." Holloway said something about a report of a smell, about wanting to check the southern corner, and Crew cut him off. And then Crew turned, and he looked at me, and he understood, in the way that men like him always understand the source of any trouble, that it had come from the statue who had dared to stop being a statue. He came to stand in front of me. He was a tall man, and he stood close, the way men do when they want you to feel them, and he looked up into my face under the bearskin, and the warm light of his own illumination played on his expensive features, and he said, loud enough now that the people on the lower tiers turned to look, because a quarrel is more interesting than a light show. "Did you start this? Did you?" I said nothing. I stood my post. "I'm told," Crew said, "that you've decided there's a fire, that you can smell it. That you, the doorstop, the bit of furniture I pay to stand still and look handsome, have decided to play fireman in the middle of my evening and send the safety officer running about during the 1 hour this country will remember me by." He let that sit, and then he leaned in, and he dropped his voice to the thing that was worse than shouting, the patient, amused thing. "Listen to me. You stand still. That is the entire content of your existence. You stand still and you say nothing, and you let the grown-ups run the night. There is no fire. There is heat, because I have 100,000 watts of light burning out here, and a man who has never seen a real production in his life has confused the smell of working equipment with a catastrophe, because he wants, for one moment in his small gray life, to matter. Stand still. Stop ruining my picture. If you move from that spot again, if you so much as turn your head, I will have you off this forecourt and out of that uniform by morning, and I promise you, doorstop, I have the telephone numbers to do it. I have been provoked many times in 19 years. I have been spat on. I have been slapped by a drunk who wanted to see if a guardsman would hit back. I have had men order me to kneel, to salute, to dance, men who thought the uniform meant I was a toy that had been left out for their amusement. I had learned, long before that night, to let it all pass over the surface of me like rain over stone. And on any other night, Crew's words would have passed the same way. He could call me a doorstop until his voice gave out. It cost me nothing. But he had told me there was no fire and to stand still, and I had smelled the smoke. I will tell you what I did, because it is the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than carrying the dead across the frozen yard at Brennan Wharf, and I am not proud of how close I came to failing it. I held my post, and I held my face, and I held my tongue, and I did one thing only, one small permitted thing. I let my eyes go to Holloway, who stood frozen behind Crew, caught between the showman who could end his career and the sentry he half believed, and I held the tired man's gaze, and into it I put everything I knew, every year of Brennan Wharf, every smell I had ever trusted, and I said, lo, the only words I let myself say. Look behind the boarding. Now, I am begging you. And Holloway, God keep him, took half a step toward the southern corner, and Crew rounded on him and said, "If you touch my set during the show, you will never work in this country again." And Holloway stopped. He stopped. The careful, tired man stopped, exactly as I had stopped at 23, and I watched the machine fail in front of me. The whole machine, every channel a careful man is supposed to trust, the sergeant and the safety officer and the chain of sensible procedure, all of it overridden by one loud man who held the telephone numbers, and I understood that there was no one left between that 1,000 people and the fire but me. So I began to count. I will try to make you understand the next part, because everyone who has spoken to me about that night has wanted to know about the next part, and they always ask it wrong. They ask how I found the courage to break my post. They have it backwards. Breaking my post was the easy thing, the thing the animal had wanted to do since the first thread of smell. The hard thing, the thing that took every year of discipline I had, was not breaking it yet. Because 1,000 people sat on 8 tiers of timber above my head, and the only sure way out for them was the front stairs into the standing crowd and a chained gate, and 1,000 people who panic on 8 tiers of timber over one set of stairs do not escape a fire. They die in the crush before the fire ever reaches them. I had read that southern corner for 3 weeks. I knew that if I broke my bearing and shouted fire while the band played and the lights ran and the fireworks waited, I would not save them. I would start the stampede that killed them. What I needed was the truth made plain, a moment when the danger was visible to everyone at once, so that the crowd would believe and move and not merely panic at a guardsman's shout. What I needed was for the fire to show itself. And the most terrible discipline of my life was to stand at my post in the warm, dead air, smelling the smoke thicken, watching the faint, wrong glow begin to pulse behind the lower seam of the draped boarding, where no one but I was looking, with a little girl in a yellow dress and a paper crown 3 tiers above my head. And to wait, not for courage. I had courage to spare, to wait for the exact half-second when moving would save them instead of killing them, and not 1 half-second longer. I counted the seams of the boarding where the glow was coming through. I counted the tiers between the family in the yellow and the southern stairs. I counted the chained gate, the hand's width of play in it, the place the padlock hung. I had counted that gate for 3 days without knowing why. I knew why now. I marked Holt, who had come back to my shoulder, who had seen the glow now too, his face gone gray, his hand on his radio, waiting for the word from a sentry he trusted more than the showman he was supposed to obey. I marked the band who would have to be stopped. I marked the king in his box on the steps, far across the forecourt, oblivious. I marked the river terrace where crews still stood half-turned, furious, watching me, certain he had won. And I marked the moment the glow became a flame. It came up behind the boarding at the southern corner exactly where I had known it would, a tongue of it finding the bunting, the dry royal-colored bunting that ran the whole front of the stand. And the bunting took it the way dry cloth takes flame, in a running line. And in the space of one breath, a yard of fire was climbing the front of the eastern stand, and the people on the lower tier nearest it had seen it, and the first scream had begun. That half-second was mine. I had waited my whole life for it, and I did not waste it. I broke my post. I did not run shouting into the crowd. I have thought a great deal about why I did what I did instead, and I believe it was Brennan Wharf and 19 years of the gates working together in me without my having to think at all. I did the thing a guardsman is built to do, which is to become, in an instant, the still point that frightened people can fix on. I stepped out from the corner into the open at the foot of the southern stairs, into the light, in my red tunic and my bearskin where 1,000 people could see me. And I did not scream and I did not flap, and I pitched my voice, the voice they teach you on the square, the voice that carries over a parade ground without sounding afraid up into the tiers, and I gave them not panic but orders. On your feet, I called, and look at me, look at me. The stairs at the south end are clear and I am holding them. You will come down by tiers, top tier first, and you will not push, and every one of you will be off this stand in 2 minutes. Top tier, stand and come now. Hold the children. Look at the red coat and come to the red coat. I do not know how to explain why it worked except that frightened people want, more than anything, to be told what to do by someone who is not afraid. And a man in a guardsman's uniform standing dead still in the light while flame climbs the stand beside him is the most unafraid thing a frightened person can be given to look at. The top tier moved. They moved the way I had told them, down and toward the red coat, and the tier below moved, and I kept the voice going, low and steady and relentless. Top tier. Now the 7th. Hold the rail, hold the children, you have time, look at me. and Holt was beside me now and below me, getting them off the bottom of the stairs and out into the open. And Holloway, freed at last from the showman by the simple fact of the flame, was screaming into his radio for the fire crews and the medical teams that had been on standby the whole night, because the palace's own people, the careful overruled ones, had insisted on them. The fire ran up the front of the stand fast, faster than the people could come down, and I knew within the first few seconds that the front stairs and my voice would not be enough alone, because the fire was between the lower tiers and the only certain open ground, and 1,000 people coming down toward a fire is 1,000 people who will stop and surge and crush no matter how steady the voice. I needed the second way out. I needed the gate. I left the foot of the stairs to hold them, keep them coming, I'm opening the gate. And I went to the chained arch at the southern corner with the heat of the burning bunting on the side of my face, and I want to tell you it was Brennan Wharf again, the heat on one side of my face and a job in front of me, except this time the job was not carrying out the dead. This time there was still time. The chain ran through both leaves and the central post, with a hand's width of play, and the padlock hung on the inner side. I had counted it for 3 days. I did not waste a second trying to break the lock with my hands. A man who has stood in one place for 19 years thinking about the place knows better. The gate had play in it, and behind me, propped against the wall where cruise people had left it because it offended the picture, was the heavy iron bracket bar from the gate's own original fitting. The bar the palace had meant to be the gate's strength before a showman decided the gate should never open at all. I took it up. It was a good weight, honest iron, and I drove it through the loop of the chain where it crossed the central post, and I levered with my whole body and 19 years behind it, and the post fitting, which had been put in to hold a gate shut and not to hold a man's full weight against it, gave with a sound like a shot, and the chain whipped free, and the leaves of the gate swung wide onto the open river terrace and the cool, clean air and the wide, dark grounds beyond. "South gate is open," I roared up into the stand and across to Holt. "The gate is open. Bring them through the gate, the gate, the gate." And Holt heard me and turned the flow of them, the river of frightened people coming down the southern stairs, away from the fire and the crush of the forecourt crowd, and out through the wide stone arch onto the open terrace where there was room for 10 times their number and nothing at all to burn. They came through. They came through by the hundred, the donors and the diplomats and the lottery families, the old and the slow and the small, out of the burning stand and through the gate that should never have been chained, onto the safe, cool grass. I stood in the open gate and I held it the way I had held my post, and I counted them through, and I put my hands on the slow ones and steadied the old ones and lifted the small ones, and somewhere in the middle of it, the family from the third tier came down toward me, the father carrying the elder girl, the mother with the younger one. The one in the yellow dress, the paper crown gone now, her face buried in her mother's neck. And they came through the gate into the open, and the mother's eyes found mine for 1/2 second as she passed, and there was nothing in them but the simple animal gratitude of a creature whose young has been kept alive, and that 1/2 second was worth 19 years of standing still. The last of them came through. Holt brought the last of them, an old man on 2 sticks and a steward who had stayed to help him, and I went up the southern stairs myself 2 at a time against the heat to be sure, the way you go back into the dark aisles to be sure, because a man who once told himself the stores were empty and was wrong does not ever again take a stand on trust, and the stand was empty, the whole 8 tiers of it empty, 1,000 people off and accounted for and safe on the cool grass beyond the gate. And only then, with the heat too great to stand in any longer, did I come back down and out through the arch and let the fire have the timber. It took the whole eastern stand in a few minutes, exactly as Brennan Wharf had taken the stores. The fire crews were there by then, and they kept it to the stand and away from the palace and the crowd, and the great structure burned itself down to its steel bones against the night sky, and the tens of thousands in the forecourt, who had been moved back and held by the standing guard and the police, watched it burn, and on every one of their lit screens the country watched it burn, and there was not, in all of it, a single person on that stand who did not walk away on their own 2 feet. Not one. I have been told a great many times since that this was a miracle, and I have let people call it that because it is easier than the truth, but it was not a miracle. A miracle is a thing that comes from outside. This came from a tired safety man who insisted on the medical teams, and a sergeant who trusted a sentry's nose, and an old promise made on a frozen yard. It came from inside. The only miracle was that, this time, I was not too late. Now I will tell you the part about Aldous Crew, because people always want that part, and they want it to be larger than it was. They want him led away in chains. The truth is quieter and, I have come to think, worse for him. He was still on his terrace when the stand went up. I am told, I did not see it, I was at the gate, that he stood at his console with his headset still on, watching the catastrophe unfold across his bank of screens, the most magnificently filmed disaster of the decade. Every camera he had placed for the fireworks now placed instead for the fire, and that for a few seconds he did not move at all, the way a man does not move when the thing he has built turns in his hands. The cameras he had set to make him immortal made him immortal. They had caught all of it. They had caught the sergeant breaking from his post, and the safety man hurrying and the showman coming down off his terrace. They had caught him standing close in the face of a sentry who never moved, and the long lenses had caught his mouth shaping the words doorstop and stand still and no fire, and they had caught, perhaps 40 feet behind his shoulder, plain in the same frame, the first glow already poolsing behind the boarding, he was forbidding anyone to check. The country did not need an inquiry to read that picture. The country could read it on its own screens within the hour. There was an inquiry, of course. There always is. It found what I have told you, that the fault was likely in the transformers or the cabling run too close to the mast lighting in the southern corner, heating through a long still evening, that the chained gate was a grave breach of the regulations governing means of escape, that the palace safety officer had raised both the matter of the gate and, on the night, the matter of the smell, and had been overruled in both by the contractor responsible for the staging. It found that the loss of life that would, in the ordinary course of such a fire on such a stand, have been very great indeed, had been prevented by the actions of the guardsman posted at the southern corner, who had given warning through the proper channels, had been overruled, had held his post until the danger was visible to all, and had then conducted the evacuation of the eastern stand and forced the chained gate. It did not lead Aldous Crew away in chains. The fault in the equipment was nobody's crime. It was a fault. But the gate was his, and the order to chain it was his, in his own people's records and on his own cameras, and the country had watched him stand in a guardsman's face and forbid the one check that would have caught the fire while there was still time to put it out quietly and ruin no one's evening at all. Aldous Crew was never charged with anything. He simply never lit another spectacle. The men with the telephone numbers, the men whose calls he had threatened me with, did not return his calls afterward, because no one who arranges magnificent evenings for the very rich wants the man the whole country watched call a guardsman a doorstop 40 feet from a fire he would not let anyone check. He had wanted more than anything to be the man this reign remembered. He got his wish. That is the worst thing I can tell you about him, and it is true. He is remembered. The king came down off his box. I did not expect that, and it is the only part of the night that still, when I think of it, puts something in my throat. The fire was out, or nearly, and the people were safe on the grass beyond the gate, and I was standing in the open arch where I had held it, doing the thing a guardsman does when there is finally nothing left to do, which is to stand still, when the young king came across the forecourt through the smoke and the hoses and the wreck of his great evening, with his people trying to keep him back and failing, and he came to the gate, and he looked at the burned stand and at the open arch and at me. I came to attention. He was the king. You come to attention. He did not say anything clever. I have been glad of that ever since. A lesser man or a frightened one would have made a speech. He looked at me for a moment, a young man who had wanted a night the country would love and had been given instead a night it would never forget, and he said simply, "How did you know?" And I told him the truth because you tell the king the truth. A long time ago, sir, I said, I smelled smoke and was told to stand still, and I stood still and 4 men died. I made up my mind it would never happen again. That was all. He looked at me a moment longer, and then he did a thing no king of the House of Wesson had done to a guardsman in living memory. He took off his glove, and he put out his hand, and I took it, my white glove in his bare hand, and he held it a moment, and then he let it go, and he turned and went back across the forecourt to begin the long business of being a king on a night when everything had gone wrong, and by the grace of an old promise, not wrong enough. People ask me when they hear the story whether I think about how close it came. They mean the fire. They mean the 1,000 people and the 8 tiers and the chained gate. But that is not the closeness I think about. I think about the hour before the flame, the hour I stood at my post smelling the smoke thicken while a loud man told me there was no fire and to stand still. And I think about how very nearly I obeyed him, not out of fear. I had no fear left for men like Crew, but out of the terrible reasonable doubt that a careful man carries, the doubt that says you might be wrong. You might be the fool who raised the alarm over nothing. You might look small. That is the doubt that killed the men at Brennan Wharf. Not cowardice. Doubt, dressed as good sense, spoken by a man with rank. I had beaten it once before, too late at 23, by failing to beat it. I beat it that night by the breadth of a half-second, by waiting for the flame instead of the proof I would never have got. And the only reason I had the nerve to wait at all was that I had spent 19 years learning that the stillness is not nothing. The stillness is where you decide who you are going to be when the moment finally comes. I served 7 more years after midsummer, and I stood many more watches, and I was never again famous, which suited me. Famous is for showmen. I went back to the gates and the forecourts in the long gray hours, and I stood still through insult and weather and the aching cold, the way I always had, because the discipline is real and it matters. But I will tell you what I learned, the thing I would tell a young soldier if one ever asked me, which is the only thing worth carrying out of the whole of it. They will train you to stand still, and you must let them, because most of the time standing still is exactly right, and the men who cannot do it are no use to anyone. But understand what the stillness is for. It is not so that you will never move. It is so that, on the one night in a lifetime when you must move, you will move at the right instant in the right way, with everything you are, and not 1/2 second sooner out of fear, and not 1/2 second later out of doubt. A guardsman is not a man who does not move. He is a man who has earned the right to choose the moment. I earned mine on a frozen yard at 23, and I paid for the wrong choice with 4 men I still carry, and I was given, by some mercy I have never deserved and never understood, one more chance to choose right, on a warm, still night, with a little girl in a yellow dress 3 tiers above my head. I chose right. It only took one time. That is the whole of what I know, and it is enough.